The Infiniti Q45, not exactly the first thing that comes to mind when people talk about project cars, especially when your favored types of cars are the JDM or import kind, where people are talking about wanting a Supra, Skyline, RX-7, BRZ, 370Z, and a slew of other more modern cars. And I'm just over here with my early 90s luxury car that barely anyone knows about. But that's partially the reason for choosing it as my project car. No one really knows about them, and behind the now torn leather and finicky 90s electronics, I feel like there's the potential for a fun and unique platform with its engine and drivetrain layout. You can't go wrong with a rear-wheel drive V8, right? The Infiniti Q45 was launched as Infiniti's flagship model back in 1989, right as Infiniti was first introduced to the US. Infiniti was the luxury brand of Nissan, which was made to compete with Lexus and Acura, as well as domestic offerings from brands such as Cadillac, Buick, Lincoln, and Mercury. Nissan wanted to make sure that Infiniti launched with a reliable and competitive offerings, the Q45 being their biggest and sportiest vehicle, sporty used loosely, but at the time it was their fastest car and was marketed as a performance-oriented luxury car. As such, the Q45 came with Nissan's first V8 put in a car, which was the 4.5 liter or VH45DE, which is where the 45 and Q45 comes from. Displacing 4.5 liters, the VH45DE was a feat of engineering for the early 90s and overbuilt by most standards. It featured a forged crankshaft, forged rods, 6-bolt mains, along with a full-length girdle for structural rigidity. It also featured dual overhead cams and had variable valve timing on the intake cams. It was quite a modern V8 for its time in the early 90s, especially when compared to the standard pushrod V8s that a lot of domestics still use at the time, and arguably were still strangled by emission restrictions back then. The published numbers are 278 horsepower and 295 foot-pounds of torque at 4,000 RPMs, with a red line of 6,900. However, because of Japan's gentleman's agreement, all engines produced were not supposed to exceed 276 horsepower. It's believed that Nissan disabled the variable cam timing during testing, and it might actually be closer to 300 to 305 horsepower with cam timing enabled. The engine wasn't perfect, as the early models from 1990 to 1993 had some issues with the timing chain guides, which the supporting backing was made of plastic, which fatigued and cracked. Eventually this would end up causing catastrophic failure to the engine. An update kit was made which changed the guides to be made with a metal backing, and all future models were made with the updated guides. The fuel system was also updated in the newer models with more reliable injectors. The updated models are the 1994 models and up, which you can identify as they have a visible grille on the front of the vehicle, rather than the early models which had no grille. So with the introduction on what the hell a Q45 is, let's dive into my actual project car I bought and have been repairing back to a working baseline to actually start doing the fun stuff. I apologize ahead of time for not having much video. This was before I really had a decent camera for recording. I just had my old phone. So we'll be doing a slideshow for this segment. I've been involved in automotive repair since I was 16 and worked at various shops and dealers, but never really had a project car. Back in March of 2023, I finally had a chance at getting a project car, and in this case I found two Q45s. So I found a 1995 in immaculate condition, but for whatever reason the salesperson just ghosted me for about 3 weeks after the initial talks, which led me to looking for other options. So I found this 1991 Q45 with 130,000 miles on it for about $2,000, but it had a misfire. This one was clear across the country, so I opted to have it shipped about 1,700 miles away, which was still cheaper than the 1995 Q45 I saw previously. After purchasing the vehicle and setting up shipping, I got the vehicle in the middle of April. As you can see from the pictures, it was quite dirty from being on the car carrier for almost a week, but initial looks were promising. The body was mostly straight minus a few dings. It started and ran, but did have a pretty obvious misfire, and the exhaust was leaking. So I gave it a thorough wash and then dove into diagnosing the misfire. I found at the minimum the number 3 injector was toast. I determined this using 3 tests. The injector was not clicking when listening with the stethoscope. These injectors have a very distinct click when they are operating. I also disconnected the coils one at a time with the engine running to isolate which cylinder was dead. Unplugging the number 3 cylinder caused no RPM drop, meaning it was not contributing anything at all. I measured resistance of the injector and it also showed an open, so there was infinite resistance. So I ordered a new injector and got to work tearing stuff apart. Right away I found myself making a list of everything I'm going to need. This wasn't going to be a simple one injector fix. Every single hose had hardened to the point that they could not be removed without breaking them. And I also found oil leaks in the engine valley, which had oh so pleasantly mixed with a giant rat's nest, which required me buying a shop vac just to suck it all out. Once I was able to access the fuel rail, I decided to check all the other injectors I couldn't get to and found 5 out of the 8 injectors were out of specification for resistance, or they also showed an open. So instead of 1 injector, I replaced all 8. Since I had access to the engine valley, I replaced the coolant bypass hoses with silicone hoses, because I did not want it to go back in here again in case the original ones started to leak after I fixed everything. At that point I noticed the valve covers were leaking and someone else had resealed the whole front of the engine along with the valve covers, poorly I might add. So now it turned into resealing the valve covers, which, fun fact, the early VH45 DEs did not use gaskets for the valve covers. They are entirely sealed with RTV, minus 2 tiny rubber half moons that seal the back of the cams. That was a lot of scraping and resealing. Also, since I had the valve covers off, I cleaned them, I prepped them, and I painted the valve covers with a crinkle red paint to help it all pop under hood. Some other things I replaced was a cooling fan, as it was very cracked due to age, the thermostat, since I was in there, might as well, radiator hoses, knock sensors, spark plugs, and probably a handful of other things that I'm forgetting. After a month of working on the engine and waiting on parts, I finally all got it back together for the moment of truth. So this is how the car sits now. After I got it running, I ended up driving it to another location where I had more room and also where my welder's located at. So the initial plans, now that I've got it to kind of a running state now, is the first big project I'll be working on is the exhaust, since the stock exhaust was completely rusted out. And I'll show some video and pictures of the stock exhaust so you can kind of see the extent and also the plans. But after the exhaust, I will be installing BC Racing coilovers and also replacing all the brakes as all the pads are worn, the rotors are warped. And then once I get the coilovers installed, I'll also get an alignment just because the steering wheel is a little off-center already. But the coilovers will be good because one of the right rear shocks are blown out and the it'll just be good to get it out of the, the 4x4 mode. And from there, it'll probably just kind of be a daily for a little bit. And then the next thing I'll be setting up for is a manual transmission swap. So I will likely be going with the Z32 5-speed transmission. And I'll be using an adapter plate to get the 5-speed to adapt to the VH45. But I think the gearing on the 5-speed is a little bit better. You can also use a 350Z or a G35 6-speed manual transmission, but I think the Z32 just packages slightly better, and I also kind of like the adapter plate better for it because the 6-speed requires you to use the automatic transmission flex plate to keep the signal, and then you had to like slap that on with a flex or with a flywheel and then the clutch and everything. So it's kind of an unusual arrangement. I mean, it works. It's just I prefer the Z32 setup, which seems a little bit simpler. And then once I get all that done, then we're talking in the future here. We'll probably be looking at turbocharging or supercharging, and then we're trying to run a standalone. Which, going back to the exhaust, we were looking at a 3-inch exhaust, and, for a stock engine, that's a little overkill, but I'm kind of future-proofing at this point, just to prepare for eventually forced induction. And that way I don't have to redo the exhaust down the road when I need to do that. And with the manual transmission, I might have to modify the stock exhaust manifolds. And at that point, I will just weld on a 3-inch adapter to the stock manifold, and then I can just have a full 3-inch exhaust instead of it going from the stock 2¼ inch to an adapter to 3-inch, and it'll just be 3-inch the whole way back. So here's a better look at the stock exhaust. It's already slightly taken apart as I'm kind of salvaging some of the brackets and things, but you can see how rusted out the exhaust is coming right off the manifolds. I've actually already cut the flange off on that pipe there. And then this is one of the post catalysts. And I'm going to salvage these brackets on the post catalysts because they are for they're part of the mount setup. So I'm going to try and integrate that with the new exhaust. And the reason they're so rusty is because those covers or heat shields I think they had like a fiberglass insulation inside, and they're just holding all the moisture right up against the exhaust. So, but yeah, these are the stock flanges that I cut off of the exhaust, and they actually need to be trimmed down a little bit more because you can see the double walled piping, so I won't be able to weld to that. And up here is the adapter. So the stock exhaust size is 2¼ and the adapter is going from 2¼ to 3-inch. So again, I know it looks a little ridiculous for a stock engine, but eventually that whole flange adapter there is going to be removed in place of a full 3-inch flange, and that'll be done probably when the manual transmission swap happens, because I believe you have to re-weld the manifolds to get the bell housing to clearance. So here's the Vibrant Performance resonators. They're just a 3-inch resonator. I think they're 12 inches long. I got the smallest ones essentially that I could find that were 3-inch size, just so that they were easier to package within the limitations of the Q. And we also have the MagnaFlow mufflers over there as well, also 3-inch. So that's pretty much how it's going to go together in the front there. And I'm going to do my best to utilize all the stock mounts, or at least the stock mount placements, and that way everything fits where it's supposed to be. The exhaust will be secure, and I won't have any issues with it. The only thing I'm probably going to change is just to mainly, I'm debating between pulling the exhaust all the way to the back or having it dump out kind of right before the rear subframe. Mainly because there's a little bit of limited space on that rear subframe, and I'm not sure if 3-inch piping will clear because it runs underneath the subframe. So with it lowered, along with a 3-inch exhaust running underneath of it, I'm concerned about it rubbing or scraping. So with the intro out of the way, the next episode is mainly going to be on the exhaust, and here's a bit of a sneak peek.